Hello everyone, welcome to Love and Philosophy. This is Andrea. Today I'm talking with John Koethe, who is a poet-philosopher. We talk about the oscillation of self and how this is a way of bridging dichotomy. Holding the paradox becomes necessary when you begin to understand yourself as oscillating between categories, such as poetry and philosophy. John Koethe is both. He's both a poet and a philosopher, but he's very well known for his poetry. He's won quite some awards, like the Lenore Marshall Award, which he won for 95th Street, his poetry book from 2009. John is from San Diego. He was born in 1945. He started writing poetry in the 60s when he was an undergraduate at Princeton University, and he became friends with poets like John Ashbery and even Frank O'Hara, as we talk about here. He got his PhD in philosophy from Harvard, and he's been teaching philosophy. He's actually retired now, but he taught in Wisconsin for many, many years. But at the same time, he was always writing poetry, and we talk about how he balanced those worlds of poetry and philosophy and how they are each in both in different ways. You can definitely feel it in his poetry. It's one reason I love it so much. A friend introduced me to it way back, and I've been reading him ever since. His books tend to come around the world with me, which is fitting because they're a lot about exploration of landscape, both geographical, but then it ends up feeling very mental and emotional. Quite often when I read his poems, I have a sense of childhood or nostalgia or something from years past, which is not quite a memory, but more a feeling of being on a street or a smell or something sensory. So he's pretty amazing in the way he can conjure that with his words. And there's nothing flashy about it, but it becomes very intimate. So we talk about his writing and what poetry is and philosophy and how our self is an oscillation and we can never really pin it down, but there's a way in which we can notice that movement, and that happens in the best poetry or the best philosophy even, where you feel the movement as you are the movement, so to speak. There's one book I just happened to pick up that I've been carrying around of his called Falling Water, and I just noticed for the first time, but the cover is a Van Gogh painting, and this painting is hanging apparently about 40 minutes away in the Amsterdam Van Gogh Museum, so maybe I'll have to go see it. But I bring it up just because it reminds me of his poetry. There's a kind of revisiting of places and seeing them in a new way. So anyway, I opened this book and there's a poem called The Realm of Ends, which has a lot to do with extremes and moving beyond them, which is fitting. So I'll read that at the end of our conversation. I'm really glad you're here. I hope today is a good day for you, wherever you may be, and that you have a little poetry in your life of some kind, the kind you like. All right, here we go. Hi, John. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for being here today.
You, Andrea?
So you're in Milwaukee today, right?
I am, yes. I've lived here since 1973.
I love your poetry. I love your writing. You're a poet and a philosopher for those who might know you on one side or the other. But as we get into your work, you've often said that poetry is about conversation with yourself or talking to yourself in a particular way.
I do sort of think of it that way.
I wonder when in your own life, or if we can go back to when you were a young man, young boy, you started to think about that conversation with self, or when did you begin to talk to yourself, if I could put it in those terms?
I'm not sure I can put a date on it. Though I don't have any religious beliefs anymore, but I was brought up very religiously, first Catholic in Catholic school, and then my mother restaged the Reformation and we all became Lutherans. So I said religion is, always, for me, has always involved a great deal of introspection. And even though all that religion kind of fell away during, by high school, still that's probably when I sort of first thought of it, though I didn't come to literature until later, but I suspect that my religious upbringing has something to do with my introspective nature.
That makes sense. It makes me think of prayer.
Yes. And as I say, I really believed these things quite seriously. And then all of a sudden they just evaporated. And now it just seems to me superstition, though I still consider, myself a kind of spiritual poet, but not in any religious sense. I mean, even though Eliot's one of my great models, I don't share any of his religious beliefs, though I'm not sure what they are actually. But
Yeah, but he was also he had a degree in philosophy, right? I think you
yes,
talk about that
yeah,
in.
finished his degree at Harvard, and if he had come back, he would have had a job waiting for him at Harvard. But he never came back to the United States and pursued that.
These are definitely not disconnected, even if they're separate pursuits. The what might be religious when we're younger, and the philosophical, and the poetic. But when did the break come? You said it
Uh,
just suddenly evaporated. Was it through
well,
education or?
I don't know that there was a break exactly. It's just, when I think by the time I was in high school, though we went to church and whatnot, but I didn't really have any strong religious beliefs by the time I was in high school. So I suppose it started to evaporate probably around, junior high, sixth, seventh, eighth grade, around in then. But what replaced it really was an obsession with science and then mathematics. So I didn't go directly into literature and philosophy. In fact, those came rather later.
Your first passion was the more scientific mathematics side.
Yes, yes. Well, I've been thinking about that lately. In fact, it's in some sense, it's the theme of my new book that's coming out next year. But yes, I was a kind of science fair whiz kid, and though what I worked on, for my science projects were things having to do with rocket engines and models, but what I was really interested in was physics and mathematics, and I was determined that I was going to become a mathematical theoretical physicist. And in my senior year, it really came down to choosing between MIT and Princeton, and I thought I was about to go to MIT, and then a thought occurred to me that, well, what if I were there, and though it would never happen, what if I'd then lost interest in physics and math, and then I'd be stuck there at MIT. I didn't realize they had a good philosophy department, but so I thought, well, what Princeton's math and physics departments are, if anything, better than MIT. So I think I'll go there. And sure enough, after my freshman year, for somewhat different reasons, I kind of lost interest in physics and mathematics,
Hmm.
and I had started I didn't really know what philosophy was about in high school. I always thought that it was Walter Kaufman. I didn't realize that what real philosophy was like, but I decided I really liked philosophy and decided to major in that. And then in high school, even though I did all my serious obsession was with science, I did read an awful lot of modernist fiction, Joyce and Faulkner and Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Dostoevsky, but I even wrote a little bit, but I'd never read any modern poetry. I'd read, maybe a little Frost, and that was about it. But then in my sophomore year in college, I took a course in modern literature from Carlos Baker, who was Hemingway's first biographer, and it included both poetry and fiction. But that's where I first read modern poetry, and in particular Yeats and Eliot and Pound
Oh,
and others. And I was just bowled over by it, and I didn't really know what it was, but I thought, well, I just want to try to do this, whatever it is,
oh.
and that became my obsession.
Hmm.
And then I also stopped running track and started smoking, and so it
Ah.
was a complete collapse decadence for my high school.
That's interesting because that seems like a different kind of way of approaching the world when once you read the poetry. Of course, I'm generalizing it too much, but I mean, in your poetry, for example, you do talk about writing almost like with a sense of disillusionment, I think is the word you use,
Yes,
of trying to
different.
see the world from a particular place, which makes sense with the science and math side. But then there's this very spiritual undercurrent, which I mean, we already talked about the religious a bit, but Was that what Yeats woke up in you in a different way, or how can you think of
Also,
that?
and Eliot in particular, and Pound a bit too, but it seemed like a kind of, well, it was a kind of deflationary impulse that I responded to, in particularly in Eliot. But it's basically my impulse has always been a form of romanticism, and I think romanticism really is, you know, basically a way of talking to yourself. I always think of Harold Bloom's book title, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, where he thinks of the Shakespearean soliloquy as the quintessential human romantic gesture. And though I became obsessed with modernist poetry, I think of romanticism or modernism as really a continuation of romanticism. It's just a deflation of romanticism. Instead of an affirmative gesture, it becomes a form of deflation or disillusionment of romanticism, but it still shares the same obsessions. It just is no longer affirmative. So that's the way I kind of, and I also like the fact that I pursued philosophy as my major, and there wasn't a writing program at Princeton, as there were hardly any places in those days. This was in the early 60s, but there were a lot of very serious student poets, and we all hung around together and told each other what to read, and we kind of had a disdain for the English department. So I always thought of poetry as separate from my academic.
Even with the smoking and the quitting track, it's almost like a rebellious kind of space. Did it
Yeah,
feel like, or a freedom or emancipation, or I don't know?
that's the way I've always thought of it. That I'm not being tied to it professionally. I had a freedom to do whatever I wanted, and as I say, I first responded to people like Eliot and Pound, which was themselves, were represented a kind of rebellion against poetry as it was at the end of the 19th century. But the poets I was drawn to when I first then started reading contemporary poetry, I never really cared much for the beats, and I didn't initially what were kind of academic poets like Robert Lowell and others, though. But I was first drawn to the Black Mountain poets, Robert Duncan in particular, and I liked the kind of disjunctive way they wrote, and with a
A
lot of,
focus on the language itself, right? Or do I remember
it was
correctly?
very much the focus on language and representation.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a poet named undergraduate, a year ahead of me, named Lewis McAdams, and he knew a lot of people in New York, poets in New York, and would bring them to campus for readings. And through him, I was introduced to the work of the New York School poets, Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery and others. And I was just blown away by Ashbery in particular, that it had all of the kind of disjunctiveness and concern with representation that the Black Mountain poets did, but it had a much more deeply lyrical and romantic. Well, Duncan was quite romantic too, but I just, and it had a kind of informality to it that I really responded to. And
Especially Mountains and Rivers, I guess.
the first book of Ashbery's I read was The Tennis Court Oath, which is
Oh, yeah, wonderful.
but I read it just before Rivers and Mountains came out.
Rivers and Mountains, yeah.
Read them both at the same time, and I didn't. A lot of people thought that there's a radical difference between Rivers and Mountains and the Tennis Court Oath, but since I really read them around the same time, I saw more of the affinities between them. And I was involved in. There was a big arts weekend at Princeton, not just poetry, but all the arts. And I was involved in that. And Lewis McAdams had arranged the poets, and the people who read were Allen Ginsberg and John Ashbery and Ted Berrigan and John Wieners. And I introduced myself to Ashbery there, and we hit it off immediately and became very good friends, and remained so for the rest of his life. And he invited me to a poet party the next week where I met Frank O'Hara, and then I had
Oh, you
dinner.
met Frank O'Hara. Whoa. Wow.
And then a week after that, I had dinner with Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, and Kenneth Koch.
What was
Yeah,
that like, having dinner with
well, it was
O'Hara?
amazing. In fact, there's a long poem in my book, 95th Street. The title poem of that book is it starts with recounting that dinner from there. But yes, it was amazing. I was not supposed to. I was supposed to just stay for have a drink, and then they were going to stay and finish a play that they had started years before, but had never finished. They hadn't actually seen all three of them together hadn't for quite some time. But, one drink led to another, and everyone soon I stayed for dinner, and the play was forgotten. I just remember Kenneth Koch looking over at me at one point saying, "Love to see a boy eat."
Ah.
So that was really the start of a marvelous relationship. I mean, I think John's first come on was, "Oh, John, you're the only boy I've ever loved." And I said, "Well,
Aw.
but John, I'm straight, and I hope we'll be friends." He says, "Oh, that's all right." So, and then
Oh, how wonderful that you just fell into that world.
I was driving Lewis's Austin Healey, and it was foggy, and I was driving too fast and had an accident. So that kind of
Oh.
sealed our friendship.
Aw.
Fortunately, he neither of us was hurt. I thought I'd killed the guy here hit, but he wasn't actually hurt very badly. So
Oh, that must have been scary though. But
yeah,
yeah, you go through something like that, it bonds you.
but yeah. But so I knew most of the younger New York poets. In fact, the first poets I met before Ashbery was Peter Sheldall and Kenward Elmsley. Lewis brought them to campus, and
Oh, wow.
so I would hang around with them. I met Larry Fagan that way. I think I met him in 67 or 68. I can't remember exactly what.
I just talked to Daryl Pinckney. I don't know if you've met him, but I've
I
been
know.
thinking a lot about this time period because that generation was like, for me, very inspiring, that there was actually a group of people talking about poetry and literature in this way and sort of living it. I don't know. I almost feel like it's a myth. From Daryl's side, it was more Elizabeth Hardwick and Lau and that
Yes.
Brahmin kind of tradition that he was in.
Yes.
But for me, I was much more interested in New York school too, and I worked at St. Mark's Bookshop, and But I wonder, from your perspective, was it real? Was it a myth?
It was quite real. In fact, I initially thought of myself as a kind of New York poet. Um,
Well, the Blue Vents is kind of in that style, right? Was that your
it
first?
very much is. I mean, and it's very, sort of imitative of Ashbery. But Ashbery actually had very wide ranging tastes. And
Mm.
it was through him that I always associated, say, Elizabeth Bishop with Robert Lowell. And at the time, I didn't Lowell or Berriman at all, though subsequently I did.
Mm.
But I knew her. John was very fond of, Elizabeth Bishop was his favorite poet, and then Marianne Moore also. And I gradually, and then I had a real temperamental affinity with John's poetry. And so when I was imitating that, it felt natural. But when I started trying to write like people like Ted Berrigan or Ron Paget or Frank
Mm.
O'Hara, I didn't think it was very good. And also around that time, I began to realize, I mean, one of the things about the New York school was they were very strict on who you should and shouldn't read. And I began to rebel against that.
Yeah.
And I decided I was going to read, even though I still like to be limited to that. And I remember W.H. Auden was giving a number of interviews, and he talked about how he wrote 6 poems a year. And I remember thinking,
Well,
it would be interesting. I think I'll write a poem that I take a really long time on, and I revise a
mm.
lot. So
Is
I
that the
wrote it
constructor or?
called Domes, which
Oh.
was the title poem of the book after Blue Vents that won. And I was reading Hart Crane and a biography of
Mm.
Hart Crane and his poetry. And I don't know if the influence showed, maybe a little bit in some things if you
Well,
know what's there.
Dome itself, the title does.
Yeah. And and it was really successful. Everyone liked it. And I remember Larry Fagan particularly liked it.
Huh.
And Poetry magazine published it right away. And so ever since then, I still write that way, just a few lines a day, and it takes a long time. And but that's after that, I still liked, a lot of New York poets, especially Ashbery and James Schuyler, and Kenneth Cope too.
I
Franco,
like Kenneth.
there are kind of five Frank O'Haras I've decided, and I like some of them, but not all of them.
Yeah, there's just something about him and the whole art thing.
Oh, right, and he was really the center of that. The New York school as a social movement. And after he was killed, that
In an
it
accident. I
changed
mean,
quite a.
to talk about that. Yeah, you almost hit someone, but it was making me think of him in that card. And
Well, he was killed that was just about 2 months after I had dinner with him at that. Yeah, it was just. In fact, I remember Peter Sheldall sent me a postcard that summer. That's how I learned that Frank O'Hara had been killed. He
oh goodness.
wrote me to tell me. Um,
Yeah, there's something in all those poets. Maybe I can start to bring out the idea of contrast, because when I was reading them and also you, there's this kind of cadence of not, I guess, disillusionment, but not, almost like a step back, talking to yourself, right? You have to step away from
yes,
the subject in order to talk to the subject. But there's also almost sometimes at the edge of reason, or almost an ecstasy is bubbling in there. Does that make sense to you? Almost where something doesn't quite make sense, even though you're being so sensible?
yes, and I think it. My basic impulse, underlying impulse, is romantic, and I think I've written about this in a number of the pieces in book Thought and Poetry. But the fundamental romantic gesture is the Kant's gesture of the sublime, in which in its Kant's form, you're confronted with some physical enormity. The Alps were big at the point of annihilation, but then you have a kind of counter movement in which you realize that, you know, great as those Alps are, you can hold them in your mind and in that sense transcend and rise above them. And that's the gesture of the sublime. And I kind of think of Thomas Nagel's subjective versus objective point of view as a kind of very generalized version of that um, oscillation of the sublime between the physical world and then the transcendent self that overcomes it. It's just that in classical romanticism originally, it culminates in this affirmation of this transcendent self. And that's what you find throughout Wordsworth. Though I think what happens in modernism is you realize you can't believe that anymore, even though you're tempted and drawn to it, as Stevens is. You really can't engage in romanticism in good faith as an affirmation.
Is this what you mean by romantic opposition when you talk about that? Or and
Yes.
by the romantic, is it just for people who don't know all these terms or don't want to go try to figure it all out? I think it relates very much to things all of us can understand. The romantic, do you mean getting carried away a bit and taking the subjective too seriously? That's why you have to leave it? Or
Well, that you just can't, the Kantian sublime is not really an argument. It's just kind of it affirms the transcendence of the self because it can take in the physical world. But of course, that's really not an argument. That's, in a way, it's kind of almost a superstition. It's another form of superstition like religion. Though I actually have become a kind of very qualified philosophical dualist, so I can talk about that some if you want.
yeah,
But
I do.
still, you can't really. I mean, so instead of this, the the Kantian sublime, it is a real experience, and everyone, most people have had a version of it, even though they don't know what it's called or how Kant.
So would you mean, just for those listening, something transcendent where you forget yourself? So where you so identify, for example, with nature, if we want to talk about Wordsworth, or if you want to, or you so identify that you are overwhelmed by something that you don't consider yourself, you lose yourself. Is that?
Well, that you feel yourself apart from nature. It's a kind of philosophical dualism that there's the physical world and there's the mind or the soul or the self or whatever you want to call it. And that's distinct from nature and in some sense transcends it. And that's at least in the classical romantic version in Wordsworth's. But but at some point you just can't in good faith really believe that, though I do believe something like that, a very qualified form of philosophical dualism.
You can't believe that the self is different from consciousness and mind. I mean, the body is different from consciousness and self.
Well, I do actually think so, though this reflects based on a kind of reading of Wittgenstein by my advisor Rogers Albritton in an unpublished paper so I think there's a paper that I included in Thought and Poetry called Metaphysics and the Mind-Body Problem.
That's where you talk about Nagel.
Well, I think I first talk about Nagel in an earlier paper called Poetry and the Experience of Experience.
Okay.
That one's no, the one on the mind-body problem that's a straight philosophy paper and doesn't talk about poetry at all. Though I did give it an epigraph from John Ashbery's poem Sestina on Popeye that reads, "If this is all we need from fear from spinach, then I don't mind so much." So it picks up. Rogers Albritton has this reading of Wittgenstein in which he thinks, yeah, Wittgenstein really does think that you refer to pains and those things, and there are such things. It's just that he says they're metaphysically thin. That is his phrase. They're real, but they aren't as real as things that are metaphysically more robust. And that's kind of the way I now think of the status of the mind and what are called qualia, that, yeah, they really are real. And for basically Cartesian reasons, the mind is distinct from the body. It's just metaphysically thin and you don't have to worry about it. And yes, we're completely material beings. It's just that this gives rise to perspectival consciousness. And for basically Descartes' reasons, we can't identify the mind with the body or any part of it. So, but but don't worry about it. That's kind of
right.
my current.
Well, yeah, something I think about a lot and that maybe draws me to read you and that you talk about in different ways in the different essays. I'm sorry to keep them all separate, but you do talk about this, like the self being real is one extreme, and then the other extreme would be that it's an illusion, a deep illusion, and this is what we're talking about now. But then you can't really believe in either of those fully, even if you know one is true. You can't fully believe in it. So what I think of a lot is holding the paradox. Talk about Eliot and coming back. This oscillation, right? Eliot, where you come back to where you know were started and know it for the first time. And you talk about oscillation, and your poetry is a kind of oscillation between the subject and the objective exploration. But overall, you're sort of holding the paradox, aren't you? You're sort of, as you just expressed, we're using language just to get to know this movement. It's not that we can ever really freeze it at some spot of opposition or.
I think that's right. And I think there's a tension between, the subjective viewpoint and the objective viewpoint, to put it in Nagel's terms, and that both of them are incomplete. I mean, from a subjective viewpoint, to use Wittgenstein's phrase, the world is my world, and I'm the only mind there is, and my world is the only world there is. But then from an objective point of view, I'm completely insignificant and not even real. And there's just this kind of oscillation between these two things. And in fact, that's kind of the theme of my new book that's coming out next year called Cemeteries and Galaxies. And it actually has a lot of physics and mathematics and astrophysics in it too.
One or two physics-ish poems that I'm remembering, at least.
There are a few, and if you this book has some ones that are explicitly so. In fact, the last poem is a longish poem called Solvay 1927, which is the Solvay conference, was the big conference of all of the great physicists of the day, Einstein and Bohr and Dirac, and
amazing.
they were all there. And
that speaks to sort of particle and wave, and I can see a through line in all of this. I'm probably projecting because the philosophy I work on is trying to understand how we hold this paradox and even start to understand that as more of the reality instead of, which is what you're doing, instead
yes,
of saying, okay, we have to choose between subject and object or mental and physical or self and illusion or whatever, that, or real and illusion, that we understand those are different ways of trying to understand this process by which you have to hold it, which is what you do, I think, with your poetry.
that's absolutely right. And what I've also come to think in the last couple of years, and which is really the theme of this new book, is that, I mean, we think of modernism as constituted by art and literature, but there's modernism is equally applicable to not just to philosophy, but also to physics and even mathematics. I mean, look at Douglas Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, Bach.
I love that book. And Strange Loop, too. It's even
Yeah.
more.
And in fact, I think the reason, I mean, I'm still very interested in physics and keep up with it, even though don't know enough to do it, to actually work on it. But I mean, quantum mechanics is a real mess, and there is no accepted interpretation of it, even though it's clearly right in the terms of what it predicts and it makes possible, but no one knows what it means. And I think the reason is the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which has now pretty much been abandoned and discredited. But I think that stuck around for basically modernist reasons, namely lazy. It's weird, it's modern. And I think the Copenhagen interpretation was a manifestation of modernism in physics. And I think modernism is now kind of over for various reasons.
It's true, but it's also, if we put that in the context of holding paradox, there's always this oscillation in the same way. So we can never really pin it down. For me, it's almost like quantum physics is trying to teach us a new practice of how to understand the world, which something like your poetry could also maybe be not trying to teach us in a conscious sense, like you sit down to try to do it, but through reading it. I've been reading it for a long time, and I get a similar feeling of this practice of how to look at myself and hold what is myself, and also in that process change self or open to a new self. You do this too. We could talk about how you talk about embodying the perspective, right? That's what you're doing in the poems too. And this feels like a practice is not so dissimilar from what happens even in all the debate about physics.
Oh, yes. No, I think that's right. But I think, well, the philosopher of physics that I like most, well, there are a number of them, but Tim Maudlin in particular. But the quantum mechanics was really held back by the refusal of. In fact, that's one reason why when I got to college, I became disillusioned with physics, because it turned out that when I started taking physics, you didn't really learn this kind of sexy stuff that you learned in reading in high school. You had to learn classical mechanics. And then it turned out that physicists weren't really interested in the foundations of quantum mechanics. That was left to philosophers. And in fact, that was a good way to get tenure, was to worry about that in a physics department. So a few exceptions like David Bohm and a few others, but by and large, physicists didn't worry about the foundations of quantum mechanics. And now they do, and no one knows what to say about it now.
I wrote about David Bohm as part of my philosophy thesis, connecting it to Hegel, and I got so much pushback because people didn't consider him a real physicist.
And plus, he had political problems too.
Yeah, I know. I didn't know about all that at the time,
but no, well, his views are one of the three possible. The other is the multiple worlds version, and the other is kind of Italian version.
the Ravelli. Yeah.
Yes. No, it's not Ravelli. It's though he writes about it a lot too.
That we could talk about physics, and it's really fascinating to me. But I think what I want to try to come back to is this oscillation, and I guess what big picture quantum physics is trying to deal with, which is that we can always see things from more than one perspective. And see them as true from that perspective at that moment, so to speak, which doesn't mean it's going to be true from another perspective later. And that's very confusing and hard to hold. But I feel that with your poetry, that you, through exploring perspectives, you're finding ways to do that, that I wonder if it's satisfying in the sense of, because we've talked about religion at first, you were very into that, and that's kind of going to one long side of the oscillation. And then math and science, that's another side of the oscillation, but neither are going to be satisfying because they can't be forever, right? It's one
That's right.
stream.
And the poets and philosophers who I'm most drawn to, well, there's an essay in Thought and Poetry called, what's it called? Gestures of Temptation and Refusal in Wittgenstein and Stevens. And they both exemplify it. I mean, if Stevens is constantly saying, making romantic affirmations and then taking them back.
Does he say in one of his poems, I am my world and you are your world, or something like that? I kept hearing that when I was reading Thought and Poetry again, because you talk about Wittgenstein and he says that too, right? Is that connected?
I am my world, microcosm. That's from the Tractatus. But I wrote that essay on Stevens and Wittgenstein because they both exemplify this kind of oscillation between being tempted by, in Wittgenstein's case, a philosophical picture and then reacting against it, but then being, people, I dislike these kind of facile readings of Wittgenstein, in which he somehow showed us how to stop doing philosophy, because he thinks it's a temptation that you're drawn to, and even though you may know in some sense that it's illusory, you can't help it. You can't break its spell, so you're constantly being drawn to it and then attempting to see through it and then being drawn in. And it's exactly the same as in Stevens too.
It's that same kind of strange loop. I don't know if you've experienced this, but when I think of the constraint, that's a word too that comes up. Maybe if we talk about the difference between philosophy and poetry, for example.
Oh, yes.
But when I think of Wittgenstein and when I think of Stevens, both of whom I love very much, I also feel, okay, life is full of feeling and suffering, and you almost need some constraint in order to deal with it. And this oscillation can become almost an illness if you're not careful, if you're too sensitive and too smart. Does that make any sense?
Well, I don't know about an illness, but it can certainly be frustrating. I
Yeah.
mean, uh, I think one of the astrophysics poems in the new book has an epigraph from the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, which reads, "I'm significant, screamed the speck." And so, yeah, so it is this oscillation between, from a subjective point of view, you and your world are everything, but from an objective point of view, you're nothing, and you can't sort of stay put with either of those.
And with Wittgenstein, I can see that's where I meant it could become almost an illness. You quote, I think, in the book, or one of your books, about that quote about the happy and unhappy man inhabit
Yes.
different worlds, and how this kind of perplexed you. But I can understand that because it's a similar oscillation to where if you're going to give yourself to one of these different views just in order to have a bit of peace, just a kind of foundation, then it can seem like very different worlds, right? To
Yeah.
be, yeah. Even in the poetic romantic versus the sort of more philosophical or disillusioned.
Yeah. I've never been quite clear as to what Wittgenstein meant by that, but it seems like a very powerful idea, and it's quite the last part of the Tractatus is quite at odds in temperament with the first part. But I mean, but the beginning stuff in the Tractatus, the world of the happy and unhappy man, are they're just the same. They're just configurations of objects. But by the end of it, it's a completely different view. Um, but I'm not sure what it is.
How do you think of the world and the way Wittgenstein? That's an important word.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the early Wittgenstein, he did have a conception of what the world was, configurations of objects. And I think the best account of it is found in Robert Fogelman's book on Wittgenstein. I think by the later Wittgenstein, even though my book on Wittgenstein is called The Continuity of Wittgenstein's Thought, and it's about the similarities between the early and the later philosophical outlook. Certainly the idea that there's such a thing, a single totality called the by the in the later work, though, he puts forward a version of it in the Tractatus.
I guess I was trying to get with the subjective objective idea too, or the what we're broadly discussing is more scientific or artistic or poetry or philosophical or this oscillation.
No, Thomas Nagel was. I don't know that where in Wittgenstein you'd find something comparable to subjective versus objective, but Nagel was a student of my advisor, Rogers Albritton, and was deeply influenced by Albritton and through Albritton by Wittgenstein. So I think the root of his, subjective versus objective is to be found somewhere in Wittgenstein, but I'm not sure precisely where you would find it. So I think that's.
If I feel it in there, but I don't know how to make the continuity. I think you express it, but not explicitly in these terms. So
that's the way I see it. So it comes out of there somehow. I remember.
Yeah.
I remember Rogers Albritton once telling me an anecdote about Isaiah Berlin. I remember when I was in college, Terry Penner said he was telling someone else who was wondering where to go that he should go to Harvard so he could meet Rogers Albritton, the smartest man on the Western Hemisphere, he said. And I remember once Albritton told me a story that he'd heard a remark that Isaiah Berlin made. I guess Rogers' name came up in conversation, and Berlin said, "Oh yes, Albritton, good man. He invented Nagel."
Oh, whoa, that's strong. I guess we all invent one another, or we're invented by what we read in a way and how we put it together.
Well, Rogers wrote hardly anything.
Or what we hear, the conversations, or
Well, he's famous. His
teaching.
His reputation rested almost entirely on his conversations.
This idea of conversation, I want to think about a little bit, because you've said that poetry is a conversation with yourself.
Yes.
But I also, you also write about how it's a conversation with other poets and there's scales of it. It's nested. It's not just an internal self. It's like what you're saying now, these conversations with these teachers.
Well, I think that's right. I think it's a conversation with yourself, but you have to remember, you can talk to yourself about anything. So it's not to say it's talking to yourself isn't to suggest it's not solipsistic or private or introspective. It can be about everything, though. I do think that, and this is part of what I mean when I think of modernism as having run its course. I do think one thing I reject is the idea of writing for an audience. In fact, I remember once listening to a conversation with an interview with Billy Collins in which he said that the way he writes, and I like a lot of Billy Collins's work. But he said when he writes, he begins by thinking, well, what's going to catch an audience's attention and draw them in? And I was listening to that, and I thought, my God, that's the exact opposite of the way I think of writing. And in fact, I went on to write a poem called "To an Audience," just to sort of explore that idea. But I do think what has happened in poetry with the rise of identity poetics is that the sense of poetry as a form of talking to yourself, which is, I think, what Romanticism is. I think that represents a kind of repudiation of that, because identity poetry really is directed at an audience. It's meant to affirm your connection to an audience. And that's what I've become I think it's fine if people want to write that, but it's just foreign to the way I think of poetry. And it really doesn't, it's so taken over, poetry these days that it's kind of, well, I don't really care at my age. be 79 soon, but still. And so I've kind of done what I'm going to do, I guess, anyway. But
You have a new book coming out, so it's
I
still
haven't
coming. You never know how many more will come. But it's interesting what you say, because that is a really different orientation. If you're orienting towards what do people want or something, or what will get the most, what will resonate the most with the most people or something, versus this more what I think of what you do, which is subjective exploration of perspective, which it's almost like you're looking at one person or one part of yourself and trying to embody that and explore it.
Yes, no, that's right. That's the way I think of it. But again, with the proviso that you can talk to yourself about anything you.
Right. And also, what you're talking with yourself about, all of that is patterned by the other conversations you've had with your teachers, the other
Sure.
poetry you've read.
Yeah.
It's continuous in a similar way to what we were talking about with Wittgenstein. And
It is. And I'm very much, I know Harold Bloom is somewhat controversial, but I'm very much, I mean, that's the way he thinks of poetry, as a conversation with yourself and with other poets. And I think that's absolutely right.
And you wouldn't think of philosophy this way, because I want to get to this idea of the problem, which you talk about this word problem and about speculation. And we could talk about it from the the position of the poet or the position of the philosopher. But it makes me think of, in one of the essays, you talk about this idea of Heidegger, this ultimate question of why is there something rather than nothing, and how you never really thought that was much of a question. But then the way Wittgenstein orients it gets to me to this thing we're trying to talk about, of this feeling of awe and of
Yes.
talking to yourself, realizing you're aware, that can go too far into the religious, or it can be addressed philosophically too, but it's a different set of constraints, you might say.
Well, I think I think of philosophy, and I think, I can't remember where I got the description from, 9 to 5 philosophy, someone once. But I do think that 9 to 5 philosophy is subject to constraints of coherence and consistency and relevance, and that poetry simply isn't constrained by. And it is directed towards truth in some sense, though, of course, truth is a somewhat nebulous. Philosophically, I'm kind of a realist, so I really believe in, a kind of coherent notion of truth, a kind of correspondence notion of truth. But I think both philosophy and poetry can originate in some of the same impulses. It's just that philosophy pursues them with a goal towards truth and subject to certain constraints, whereas poetry is really more in kind of concerned with feeling the force and spell of those initial impulses and exploring them and trying to inhabit them. I know that's kind of vague, but that's the way
Not at
I
all. I
think of
like
it.
that you brought up spell, because there's a
But
way in which the constraints of philosophy, it reminds me of your, your fascination with math and science and so on. That's a different way of it. Can we say they're both investigations, but with
Mhm.
different freedoms? I lost you for a minute. Are you there?
Oh,
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Can we say they're
okay.
kind of investigations with different constraints and freedoms?
You, I, I think so. I think so. The philosophy is more subject to those constraints. So, I mean, Wittgenstein is the most important philosopher to me, and he certainly, doesn't really conform to the model of 9 to 5 philosophy. So you have to read that in a fairly loose sense. So what he says about Heidegger is, I've always found very interesting, because I don't understand Heidegger, and what I've tried to, but I don't care for it that much. And I kind of share Bernard Williams' suspicion that Heidegger is maybe the only important philosopher who's basically a fraud in some sense. But you would think that Wittgenstein would react against Heidegger negatively the way the positivists did, but he didn't really. In one of his few remarks on Heidegger are quite sympathetic. And the question, Heidegger's obsessive question, why is there something rather than nothing? Heidegger apparently thought it really was a question. And of course, for both Wittgenstein and the positivists, it wasn't really it wasn't a real question, but Wittgenstein was actually sympathetic to it. What he thought, where he thought Heidegger went wrong was treating it as a question when really it's an expression of a sense of awe at the existence of the world. And that he thought was important and genuine. But if you then turn it into a question the way Heidegger seems to have, yes, that's wrong. But it's something Wittgenstein was sympathetic to. It's just a matter of, mistaking this feeling of awe, which is important and genuine, for a question which isn't really a genuine question.
That reminds me of a few things. Earlier, I was thinking about in your poetry and also in the New York School, there's a playfulness that keeps things in a space that doesn't get towards what I was talking about with illness, which can kind of happen in philosophy. The people who live philosophy fully, maybe in a Walter Kaufmann kind of sense. But the other thing is that I wanted to ask you about, do you ever you keep your poetry and your philosophy separate, or at least that's how I understood it. You did it like half a year, you would write the poetry and half a year the philosophy. And
yes, I did. Now, after I retired from philosophy well, it was 2010, I guess. I've really only written that paper on the mind-body problem. I'm not really doing philosophy anymore, so I don't. But when I was doing philosophy, I would keep them separate, though not because I thought that they were somehow incompatible, but it's just that the way I wrote both poetry and philosophy was to throw myself into them for extended periods of time. When I first wrote that poem Domes, I developed this way of writing poetry, which was writing in small amounts over an extended period of time. So I just need to inhabit that frame of mind in order to do it.
it's almost like putting yourself in two different modes of, I mean, I know you don't like this or you like it, but this idea of there being a happy world and an unhappy world being the same world for Wittgenstein. There could also be a poetic world and a philosophic world being the same world, but you're almost like, you're not a different person in those worlds, but you are, because you get into, isn't it almost like a pattern or
it is, yeah, it is that, but it's also just, there's a more practical sense. When I was in college, and at least initially at the same time, I'd work on philosophy and then I'd write a poem, but that's when I wrote poetry more quickly, and I'd finish something in a sitting or in a few days or something like that. It's just that when I started writing poems, this extended period of writing poems, I really had to sort of I'd do philosophy during the academic year, and then in the spring and summer I'd switch to poetry, and so it was in part because it's a different frame of mind, but it was really also just because for practical reasons that I'd need to have the time to devote to.
Well, we've talked about these different parts of you and these different parts of life and and they seem like opposites, but we've also talked about kind of holding the paradox and how they're both different parts or different ways of understanding the same process. But what I wanted to ask you, and the reason I brought it up, is this notion of the sublime, or what we were talking about with Wittgenstein is actually probably more accurate, of awe, of the amazing fact that we can become self-conscious, and of self-consciousness, of consciousness. This is important in your work, and I wonder when that enters in, because I know when you're writing, sometimes it's in the shower or when you're shaving, that the ideas come, and the idea of flow or being in awe, where does that come in your life? How's that changed over time?
I don't know when it starts, but I think it's just, I mean, it really is just remarkable, the fact of uh, perspectival consciousness and self-consciousness is just I mean, it seems just a miracle, and we don't understand it, and it's really just astonishing. I know it's something that most people just take for granted, but I find it the most puzzling thing there is. And
You call it the most common thing and the most unique. Again, the paradox.
well, that's true of human life. I mean, each person is utterly insignificant and at the same time the most important thing there is, and that's true of each of us. And I think it's just I don't know if you want to call it a paradox, but I don't know what else.
It's both two things being true at once, where you don't need to, they seem irreconcilable, but they're not irreconcilable. But I guess what I'm getting at too is that what role has that changed in your life, or is this a practice towards, because sometimes I feel like this disillusionment is the word you use, but it can also feel like meditation, which you do talk about in some of your writing. It's almost a Zen practice too, point of
Well,
view.
I just don't have any knowledge of that tradition, though I wouldn't be surprised if it is. I just don't know anything about that firsthand.
Well, in your own life, has it been a place you find, for some reason, I'm thinking of the swimmer now, and there's this line of, I can't remember it very much right now, but the sense that the feeling I have of the line is that you think you're alone, or you think you're with others, but then you're just alone. What I'm trying to say is, has it helped you sit with your self and also to access that place of just being aware of consciousness and in awe of it? Because there's a kind of orientation there or a practice to doing that, to being able to sit with it and be aware of it in the sense of, oh my gosh, this is something amazing. That doesn't come naturally for everyone.
Well, I guess it doesn't. I don't know. I don't know why it doesn't strike everyone as so strange, but it does me. On the other hand, I'm not a kind of uh, I'm I enjoy people and I enjoy social life and having a good time and seeing other people. So I'm not at all a kind of withdrawn or am a very private person in the sense of I think about these things, but I enjoy being with people. So I'm not someone who likes to sort of withdraw from the world.
No, but I guess there's a tenderness in there that's maybe it's easy for you to express
Well,
in your normal life. I don't know, but I don't think it's easy for most people to express. And it's something that when people read you, they can feel without without it completely overwhelming you.
well, that's nice. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I'd like to think that's true, but I hope it is.
Yeah. This is love and philosophy. So when you think about the practice of poetry and philosophy, even though they're different, and the ways you've said they're different are the ways in which we speculate and can answer that speculation through constraint, and then the way we enact subjectivity and the way we've been talking and this embodied kind of perspectivalism. But I wonder how that word love, is it uncomfortable for you? Do you ever, it's
Well,
not, yeah. Does it connect to any of these?
well, it's not uncomfortable for me, but it is true that it's not my poetry has very little to do with relations with other people, romantic relations that even my long poem Falling Water, which is the history of my my marriage, it's not really a psychological poem about my relations with my ex-wife, though the poet named Joshua Weiner said something about that poem which seemed to me to be right. He said he thought it was the best poem he knew about how what you are is the result of your past experiences in time. And that's what it's really about. It's really about the feeling of the passage of time. It's just that it embodies that in this marriage relation, but it's not really a therapeutic poem about a history of a marriage or something.
No, I don't think you use the word love very much. A couple times in the essays, maybe, but
Yeah, very little. And it's not, I'd be, it would be great if I could write about that more, but it's just something that.
well, weirdly, I think it's there. We didn't talk about it, but architecture, I think, is an important word, and place, because at least in the poetry, a lot of it, it's a very subjective, as we said, exploration or investigation without much constraint, and yet the place constrains it. Or I can tell you've thought about the architecture of the poem itself, and you've said that before, and there's some kind of interplay here where you're creating a kind of space where we can feel what I think of as love, which is this conversation or connection with ourselves and others that is a continuity. I don't know how else to really say it, but Yeah, I wonder, are you thinking in terms of architecture in place, like setting the constraints so that you can have no constraint?
No, well, no, I think that's right. In fact, the concluding lines of the long poem "Falling Water," I quote quite exactly, but I think it's something like the start of love and then the loss of love and all the intricate years between. So it's about the years, but it's what the years are framing is, the course of this love, though it's not a love poem. It,
I don't
um,
know. I mean, it's not a love poem in a Valentine's Day kind of way, but I'm not sure that love is that. I mean, it is something that's over time and that is oscillating in terms of our awareness of it. Our awareness of it or our participation in it is a kind of oscillation of awareness. And there's something about, again, I keep thinking of water and swimming, but or submersion, or there's some kind of feeling reading your poetry of that being the space we're exploring, if that makes sense.
I think so. I mean, the way I came to write that poem, Falling Water, was when I was in the process of getting divorced. That's when I acquired this interest in arts and crafts, furniture, and architecture. So the poem sort of coincides with that interest, and that's the subtext of the poem. Actually, there's a Frank Lloyd Wright house just around the corner from me where I'm sitting now.
Oh, wow.
So it's a history of this marriage, but then the subtext is the development of arts and crafts, architecture, and art. So um, I think that's what allows the poem to sort of hold together over that being so long.
Yeah. At least speaking just from my own feeling of reading you and what it's given me, I feel like I can go into a safe place and be carried along a bit and think about things deeply and feel sort of safe about it. And maybe that helps one to feel things strongly in doses that don't overwhelm and yet are in that place of awe that we were talking about, or love, I might even call it. So that's just me to saying thank you to you, actually.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that. Oh, and yeah, and as I say, some of these things are tied together a little more explicitly in this new book, which in 2 weeks, I should be getting the bound galley should be ready. I'd be happy to have them send you one if you'd like
Yeah,
to
I can't wait to read it. Yeah.
and I can send me your address and I'll tell the publisher to send you
Okay, great. I will.
a
Even
bound.
if it's in the Netherlands, or should I give you my
Oh, yeah.
US? Okay.
Oh, it can be in the Netherlands. In
Okay.
fact, I think I
Oh yeah,
asked if you
your
come
editor.
aboard. No, I think he's in Belgium, but
Wonderful. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to talk to you. And yeah, thank you for what you do in both these worlds of philosophy and poetry.
okay. And send me an address and I'll have them.
Okay, I will. Can't wait to read it. And I hope you keep writing because yeah, it's wonderful. I'm sure
Okay,
you will.
we'll see.
All right. Well, have a good day there.
Well, you
I'll send you an
too.
email. All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Hey everyone. I'm back to read a poem from John Koethe from Falling Water on page 11. It's called The Realm of Ends. As John and I talked about in the conversation you just heard, he is very influenced by Wittgenstein, and I just noticed there's a phrase in here, nothing is hidden, from Wittgenstein. It actually reappears many times in this book, but I hadn't really noticed or connected it with Wittgenstein. In any case, here is the poem I opened to today when I was looking at this book, and it seems fitting for Beyond Dichotomy. It's called The Realm of Ends. I wish there were a state of being of a different kind, not compromised and caught between the twin extremes of something inconceivable and something else untrue, between the overarching heavens and the merely human. Some things are not to be sought after in reality, not even in the mind, but in a hidden region where the soul is free and unrestrained, and thought proceeds like weightless stars across an unseen sky. Oh yes, I realize this inner paradise is just like time or other worlds or selves, impossibly remote or deep within, another intimate illusion on the border of intelligence, a thing you have to touch and brush away, because nothing is hidden. These heavens are the only ones there are, an all-inclusive frame displaying every aspect of the real against an infinite night sky, the thick, dark, translucent color of obsidian. Yet in the wakefulness that comes towards dawn, I still sometimes think of myself in a style of thinking whose trajectory must have once seemed clear, but now seems loose, strange, and difficult to follow, as somehow distant from a universe of merely changing things, eternal in the way each moment is, and free the way each star becomes increasingly elusive once it crosses the meridian.